That Christmas morning, I was carefully polishing the last of my grandmother's silver jewelry when I heard my daughter Jennifer whisper to her sister, "Mom's getting old anyway. She probably won't even notice if we take a few pieces." I froze, my hands still wrapped around the delicate sapphire bracelet that had survived 3 wars and 2 generations, only to watch my own children plot its division like vultures over a fresh carcass. The living room buzzed with the familiar chaos of Christmas morning. Wrapping paper littered the hardwood floors, coffee mugs sat abandoned on every surface, and the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen where I'd been up since 5 preparing breakfast for my ungrateful family. My back ached from the old shrapnel wound that never quite healed right after Afghanistan, but I'd pushed through the pain like I always did. 22 years in the Army teaches you to endure, to put duty before comfort, family before self. My jewelry collection sat displayed on the dining room table, each piece carefully arranged on black velvet cloth. I'd brought them out earlier to show my granddaughter Emma the stories behind each item: the pearl earrings my mother wore to my father's military funeral, the gold watch my commanding officer gave me after my second tour, the diamond ring that had belonged to my great-grandmother who'd immigrated from Ireland with nothing but hope and determination. These weren't just accessories. They were my history, my legacy, the tangible proof of the women who'd come before me and the battles I'd fought to honor their memory. Jennifer stood near the china cabinet, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass as she surveyed the collection with calculating eyes. At 34, she'd inherited my stubborn streak, but none of my sense of duty. Her husband Marcus lounged on my leather sofa, scrolling through his phone with the same disinterested expression. He wore to every family gathering. They'd driven up from Atlanta in their brand-new BMW, the one they'd somehow afforded despite Jennifer's part-time job at the boutique and Marcus's sporadic consulting work. My younger daughter Sarah crouched beside the jewelry display with her 14-year-old daughter Emma, pointing out various pieces with obvious interest. Sarah had always been the more sentimental one, the child who'd cried when I deployed and saved every letter I'd sent from overseas. But even she couldn't hide the way her eyes lingered on the more expensive items, particularly the emerald necklace that had been appraised at $12,000 just last year. "Grandma Ruth, this one is so pretty," Emma said, lifting the sapphire bracelet with reverent fingers. "Will I get to wear it someday?" The innocence in her voice cut through me like a blade. Here was a child who understood the beauty and significance of these heirloom pieces, while the adults in the room saw only dollar signs and inheritance opportunities. I'd always planned to pass these treasures down through the generations, creating new stories and memories for each piece. But watching my daughters circle like sharks, I began to question everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, his pale blue eyes fixing on the diamond tennis bracelet near Emma's elbow. "Ruth, you've got quite a collection here. Must be worth a small fortune." His tone carried that particular brand of forced casualness that people use when they're fishing for financial information. "Have you thought about getting them properly insured? You know, in case something happens?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. In case something happens to me, he meant. In case I died and left these valuable items without clear ownership. I'd survived roadside bombs and enemy fire, but somehow the threat in my own living room felt more dangerous than anything I'd faced in the desert. Jennifer shot her husband a warning look, but the damage was done. The pretense of casual Christmas morning admiration had cracked, revealing the true purpose of their interest. These weren't beloved family heirlooms to them. They were assets to be distributed, valuable commodities that represented college funds for Emma, down payments on bigger houses, or simply liquidated cash for whatever luxuries they'd been coveting. "I've been thinking about that, actually," I said carefully, testing the waters. "About what happens to everything when I'm gone." Sarah perked up immediately, her hand unconsciously moving toward the emerald necklace. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to worry about that for years and years. Only 57, and you're in great shape. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly it almost sounded sincere. Great shape. If 57 with a bad back, chronic knee pain from jumping out of too many helicopters, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 2 decades of military service counted as great shape, then I supposed I was thriving. But we all knew the reality. I'd been talking about retirement, about selling the house and maybe moving somewhere warmer where the dampness wouldn't aggravate my old injuries quite so much. Jennifer joined the conversation, her voice taking on that artificial sweetness she'd perfected as a teenager whenever she wanted something. But it's smart to plan ahead, Mom. Really responsible. Maybe we could help you organize everything, make sure all the important pieces are documented and properly stored. Documented. The word sent a chill down my spine. She wanted an inventory, a catalog of assets that could be efficiently divided. When the time came, no thought for the stories behind each piece, the emotional significance, or the careful consideration of who might truly appreciate and treasure these family heirlooms. Just cold, practical distribution based on monetary value. Emma continued examining the jewelry with genuine fascination, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of greed swirling around her. She held up a small gold locket, squinting at the tiny photograph visible through the crystal face. "Grandma Ruth, who is this lady?" I moved closer, my heart tightening as I recognized the sepia-toned image of my great-great-grandmother, the Irish immigrant who'd worked in textile mills to support her 7 children after her husband died in a mining accident. "That's your great-great-great-grandmother, sweetheart. Her name was Bridget O'Sullivan, and she was one of the strongest women who ever lived." Emma's eyes widened with interest. "What made her so strong?" Before I could answer, Jennifer interjected with barely concealed impatience. "Emma, honey, why don't you go see if there are any more presents under the tree? I think I saw something with your name on it." The dismissal was swift and effective. Emma carefully set down the locket and scampered toward the Christmas tree, leaving the adults to continue their thinly veiled asset assessment. I watched my granddaughter go, noting how naturally she'd handled the delicate antique jewelry, how carefully she'd examined each piece, how genuinely interested she'd been in the family history. Here was someone who might actually understand the true value of these treasures. "You know, Mom," Sarah said, picking up the conversation as if Emma's interruption had never happened. "Jennifer and I were talking, and we think it might be easier for everyone if we sort of divided things up now, while you're still here to tell us what each piece means to you." The euphemism was almost laughable. Divided things up. As if my jewelry collection was a pizza to be shared among hungry teenagers. As if the careful curation of decades, the thoughtful preservation of family history, the emotional investment in each piece could be reduced to a simple mathematical equation. Marcus leaned forward, finally engaged in a conversation that promised potential financial benefit. "It's actually pretty common in estate planning. My cousin's family did something similar when his grandmother started having memory issues. Prevented a lot of conflict later on." Memory issues. Another delicate phrase designed to make their greed sound like concern for my well-being. The implication that I might become incompetent, unable to make rational decisions about my own possessions, was both insulting and frightening. I'd commanded soldiers in combat zones, made split-second decisions that saved lives, navigated complex military bureaucracy for over 2 decades. But apparently, my ability to manage my own jewelry collection was now in question. "What kind of system were you thinking?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Jennifer's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone whose scheme was finally being taken seriously. "Well, we thought maybe we could take turns picking pieces, like a draft. Or we could group things by value and make sure everyone gets an equal share. Whatever seems fairest to you." Navigated complex military bureaucracy for over 2 decades. But apparently, my ability to manage my own jewelry collection was now in question. "What kind of system were you thinking?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Jennifer's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone whose scheme was finally being taken seriously. Well, we thought maybe we could take turns picking pieces like a draft. Or we could group things by value and make sure everyone gets an equal share. Whatever seems fairest to you. Fairest to me. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked around. The room at my daughters and their families, all of them eyeing my treasures with varying degrees of hunger. Where was the fairness when I'd spent my career serving my country while they built comfortable civilian lives? Where was the fairness when I'd saved and sacrificed to buy these pieces, often going without other luxuries to afford something truly special? Where was the fairness in reducing my legacy to a coldly calculated distribution of assets? The sapphire bracelet caught the morning light, sending tiny blue reflections across the white walls. I remembered the day I'd bought it, fresh from my promotion to major, finally earning enough to afford something truly beautiful. I'd imagined passing it down to a daughter who would wear it to her own military promotion ceremony, or to a granddaughter who would understand the pride and sacrifice it represented. Instead, I was watching my family turn it into a bargaining chip in their inheritance negotiations. Sarah must have sensed my hesitation because she quickly added, "Of course, you'd keep whatever pieces are most special to you. We're not talking about taking everything right now, just maybe sorting out some of the duplicates, or pieces that might be better appreciated by someone who would actually wear them." Duplicates. As if any piece in my collection was interchangeable with another. As if the pearl earrings from my mother and the pearl necklace from my grandmother were somehow redundant because they shared the same type of stone. Each piece had its own story, its own significance, its own place in the complex tapestry of my family's history. But the most cutting part of Sarah's comment was the suggestion that I didn't actually wear these pieces, that they were somehow wasted on me. It was true that I didn't often have occasions for formal jewelry in my quiet retirement life, but that didn't diminish their value to me. Sometimes I wore the gold watch while gardening, feeling connected to the officer who'd recognized my leadership potential. Sometimes I put on the pearl earrings just to remember my mother's face on the day she'd given them to me, right before my first deployment. Emma's delighted squeal from the living room broke through my dark thoughts. She'd found another small gift, probably something Jennifer had picked up at the last minute to maintain the illusion of Christmas generosity. The sound of my granddaughter's joy reminded me why I'd originally wanted to preserve these family treasures. Not for their monetary value, but for the connections they represented, the stories they told, the sense of continuity they provided across generations. Looking at my daughters now, I realized they'd lost sight of that connection entirely. They saw inheritance, not heritage. They saw financial assets, not family history. They saw opportunity, not responsibility. And in that moment, as I watched them mentally dividing my possessions like a pair of divorce attorneys, I understood that my carefully preserved legacy meant nothing to them beyond its resale value. The morning sun streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating the jewelry display in golden light. Each piece seemed to glow with its own inner fire, as if the spirits of the women who'd worn them before were trying to communicate something important. My great-grandmother's wisdom, my mother's strength, my own hard-earned pride, all of it, reduced to items on a wish list for people who'd never truly understand their significance. Jennifer checked her phone, probably calculating the time until they could make their polite excuses and return to Atlanta with whatever pieces they'd managed to claim. Marcus had resumed his scrolling, already bored with the conversation now that the distribution logistics had been established. Sarah continued to hover near the emerald necklace, her fingers tracing the edge of the velvet display cloth with obvious longing. And I sat there, surrounded by my family on Christmas morning, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in any desert, outpost, or foreign base. These people shared my blood, my name, my history, but they'd become strangers to me. Strangers who saw me as an aging woman whose time was running out, whose possessions were more valuable than her presence, whose legacy was something to be divided rather than honored. The sapphire bracelet caught my eye again, its deep blue stones, reminding me of the vast Afghan sky on clear winter mornings. I'd bought it as a symbol of my survival, my success, my determination to create something beautiful despite the ugliness I'd witnessed in war. Now it sat on display like merchandise in a jewelry store, waiting to be claimed by someone who would never understand the courage it had taken to earn the money that bought it. The Christmas morning jewelry conversation wasn't the beginning of my family's entitlement. It was simply the moment I finally opened my eyes to see what had been growing, like a cancer for years. As I sat there watching my daughters mentally catalog my possessions, memories flooded back of all the times I'd ignored the warning signs, all the moments when I'd chosen to believe their love was genuine rather than transactional. It started 3 years ago when I'd first mentioned retirement. I'd been sitting in this same living room, my feet propped up after a particularly brutal day of physical therapy for my knee, when I'd casually mentioned that I was thinking about selling the house and moving somewhere with a lower cost of living. The reaction had been immediate and telling. "Sell the house?" Jennifer had practically shrieked, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "But Mom, this house has been in our family for generations. You can't just sell it to strangers." The hypocrisy had been breathtaking. This was the same daughter who'd spent her teenage years complaining about how old and outdated everything was, who'd begged me to renovate the kitchen with modern appliances and contemporary fixtures. The same daughter who'd rolled her eyes at the antique furniture and called the wallpaper totally gross every chance she got. But suddenly, when my potential move threatened her inheritance prospects, the house had become a sacred family shrine. Sarah had been more subtle but equally transparent. "Oh, Mom, you love this place. Remember how you always said you wanted to die in the room where you were born? And think about Emma. This is her grandmother's house. She has so many memories here. Already, die in the room where I was born." I'd never said any such thing, but Sarah had a talent for manufacturing sentimental quotes that supported her agenda. The truth was, I'd been born in a military hospital in Germany while my father was stationed overseas, and I'd lived in 17 different houses during my childhood as we moved from base to base. This house had been my mother's, inherited when my grandmother passed, and I'd only moved into it permanently after my retirement from the army. But watching my daughters' faces, that day I'd seen something that chilled me more than any Afghan winter. They weren't concerned about my happiness or my comfort in retirement. They were worried about their inheritance. The house represented equity, property value, a financial safety net for their own families. My desire to live somewhere more manageable, somewhere my aging body might hurt less, was secondary to their long-term financial planning. I'd backed down that day, telling myself I was being paranoid. Families were supposed to care about preserving generational wealth, weren't they? Maybe their concern was normal, even healthy. Maybe I was reading selfishness into what was actually love and family loyalty. So I'd stayed in the house, continued paying the increasing property taxes and maintenance costs, and told myself I was keeping the family legacy intact for future generations. The pattern had repeated itself in dozens of smaller ways over the following years. There was the time I'd mentioned considering donating some of my military memorabilia to the local Veterans Museum. Jennifer had immediately suggested that Emma might want those items someday, that they were too historically important to give away to strangers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same daughter who'd shown zero interest in my military service was suddenly passionate about preserving my combat medals and commendation letters. Then there was the incident with my car. My old Jeep Wrangler had been acting up, and I'd been thinking about trading it in for something more reliable and economical. Sarah had practically had a panic attack when I'd mentioned it during one of our weekly phone calls. "But Mom, that Jeep is practically an antique. It's got to be worth something to collectors, and Emma loves riding in it when she visits. You can't just trade it away for some boring sedan." Again, the manufactured sentiment. Emma had ridden in the Jeep exactly twice, and both times she'd complained about how bumpy and uncomfortable it was compared to her parents' luxury SUV. The veterinary bills for my aging German Shepherd, Rex, had provided another window into their true priorities. When Rex had needed emergency surgery for a twisted stomach, the vet bill had come to nearly $4,000. I'd paid it without hesitation. Rex had been my companion through some of the darkest days of my transition back to civilian life, and his loyalty was absolute and unconditional. Jennifer's reaction when I'd mentioned the expense had been illuminating. $4,000? For a dog? Mom, at his age, wouldn't it have been more practical to, well, put him out of his misery? I mean, you're on a fixed income now. Put him out of his misery, as if Rex's advanced age somehow made his life worthless, as if the practical financial consideration outweighed years of companionship and love. But I'd understood the subtext immediately. Every dollar I spent on Rex was a dollar that wouldn't be available for their eventual inheritance. My emotional attachments, my sense of loyalty and responsibility, were expensive luxuries that cut into their future financial security. The most telling incident had happened just 6 months ago during Sarah's divorce proceedings. She'd called me in tears, explaining that her husband was demanding half of everything in the settlement, including the equity in their house. She'd been sobbing about how unfair it was, how she'd put more money into the down payment, how she couldn't afford to buy him out of his share. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask," she'd said through her tears, "but I was wondering if you might consider giving me some of my inheritance early. Just enough to keep the house. I promise I'll pay you back, and it's money that would come to me eventually anyway." Eventually. The word had hit me like a physical blow. She was already spending my estate in her mind, already calculating how much she could claim and when. The fact that I was still very much alive, still planning to live for hopefully decades more, seemed irrelevant to her financial planning. In her mind, my money was her money. She was just waiting for the formalities of my death to access it. I'd given her the money, of course. $15,000 from my retirement savings, money I'd earmarked for my own potential long-term care needs. But even as I'd written the check, I'd noticed she'd never actually promised to pay me back. She'd said she'd try to pay me back, that she'd pay me back when she could. But there'd been no concrete timeline, no written agreement, no acknowledgement that this was a loan rather than a gift. The divorce had been finalized 3 months later, and Sarah had kept the house. She'd never mentioned repayment again, and when I'd gently brought it up during one of our phone calls, she'd gotten defensive and hurt. "Mom, I can't believe you're worried about money when I'm going through the worst time of my life." I thought, that was a gift, not a loan. I mean, I'm your daughter. Family is supposed to help family. The manipulation had been masterful. Suddenly, I was the villain for expecting to be repaid, the heartless mother who would put financial concerns above her daughter's emotional well-being. Marcus had his own particular brand of entitlement. As Jennifer's husband, he'd never felt the need to be subtle about his interest in my assets. During family dinners, he'd make comments about the investment potential of my neighborhood, the appreciation rate of houses like mine, the smart money in vintage jewelry and collectibles. He'd even suggested once that I should consider taking out a reverse mortgage to unlock the equity in my house. Equity that would, of course, benefit Jennifer and him after my death. His latest scheme involved life insurance. He'd somehow learned about the modest policy I'd maintained since my military days and had started dropping hints about how Jennifer might need additional security given the uncertain economy. The implication was clear. I should increase my life insurance coverage to provide a larger payout for his family. The fact that higher premiums would reduce my current quality of life seemed irrelevant to him. In his mind, my primary purpose was to serve as a financial safety net for his family's future. Even Emma, innocent as she was, had been unwittingly trained to see me primarily as a source of gifts and financial support. During her last visit, she'd spent most of her time asking about what she might inherit someday, which room in the house would be hers, whether I was planning to update my will to include her college fund. These weren't questions a 14-year-old would ask spontaneously. She'd clearly been coached by her mother to start thinking about inheritance as her birthright. The pattern was unmistakable once I'd allowed myself to see it clearly. Every conversation about my future, my finances, my possessions, or my plans was filtered through their lens of financial self-interest. They'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs, desires, and autonomy, and started seeing me as a resource to be managed and eventually harvested. My military training had taught me to recognize strategic threats, to identify patterns of behavior that indicated hostile intent. The signs had all been there, but I'd ignored them because I'd wanted so desperately to believe that my family loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them. I'd made excuses for their behavior, rationalized their selfishness, and convinced myself that their concern for my possessions was actually concern for my well-being. But sitting there on Christmas morning, watching them mentally divide my jewelry collection like generals planning the conquest of enemy territory, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't their beloved mother and grandmother. I was their retirement plan. I wasn't a person to be cherished and respected. I was an asset to be managed and protected until the appropriate time for liquidation. The realization should have broken my heart, but instead, it filled me with a cold, clear anger that reminded me of the moment before combat when all emotions fall away and only tactical thinking remains. I'd spent 3 years making decisions based on their financial interests, rather than my own needs. I'd stayed in a house that was too big and too expensive for me, because they were worried about their inheritance. I'd avoided spending money on things that would improve my quality of life, because they'd made me feel guilty about reducing their eventual windfall. I'd even started second-guessing my charitable giving, something that had always been important to me. The local veterans organization, the women's shelter where I'd volunteered, the scholarship fund I'd established at my old high school, all of these causes had taken a back seat to preserving wealth for children who'd never shown any interest in continuing my legacy of service and giving. Rex padded into the dining room, his graying muzzle nudging against my leg in the way that always reminded me what unconditional love actually looked like. He didn't care about my jewelry or my house or my bank account. He cared about my presence, my attention, my affection. His loyalty couldn't be bought or influenced by financial considerations. In his simple, honest way, he'd been showing me, for years, what my family had never offered: love without agenda. Jennifer was still talking about distribution strategies, her voice animated with the excitement of someone planning a particularly lucrative business venture. Sarah had moved closer to the jewelry display, her eyes fixed on specific pieces with obvious calculation. Marcus was taking pictures of the collection with his phone, probably for insurance or appraisal purposes, and Emma had returned from the Christmas tree, sitting quietly on the floor and watching the adults with the confused expression of someone sensing tensions she couldn't quite understand. Looking at them all, I felt something shift inside me, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was there. For 3 years, I'd been living my life according to their expectations, their plans, their vision of how my remaining years should unfold. I'd been a good soldier, following orders that had never been explicitly given but were clearly understood. Preserve the assets, maintain the value. Don't spend too much on yourself. Think about the inheritance. But I'd spent 22 years in the Army, and I'd learned something that my family had apparently forgotten. Respect is earned, not inherited. Loyalty is demonstrated, not assumed. And love, real love, doesn't come with price tags and distribution charts. The woman who'd survived combat zones and military bureaucracy, who'd commanded respect from seasoned soldiers and navigated complex international conflicts, had somehow allowed herself to be reduced to a passive resource in her own family. I'd become the elderly relative who existed primarily to facilitate other people's financial security, whose own needs and desires were secondary to the preservation of generational wealth. But that woman was still in there, buried under years of guilt and family obligation. The woman who'd made life and death decisions under fire, who'd earned every piece of jewelry in that collection through her own hard work and sacrifice, who'd built a life of service and honor that extended far beyond material possessions. And that woman was finally ready to reassert control over her own story. The jewelry incident on Christmas morning was just the latest in a series of increasingly brazen attempts by my family to stake their claims on my possessions, but it wasn't. Until I started paying closer attention that I realized how systematically they'd been cataloging and evaluating everything I owned. The signs had been there for months, hidden beneath the veneer of family visits and casual conversations, but I'd been too trusting to recognize them for what they were. 3 weeks after Christmas, Jennifer called to suggest we have a family organization day to help me sort through some of my belongings. She framed it as a favor, a way to help an aging mother declutter and simplify her life, but I heard the underlying agenda clearly now. She wanted a comprehensive inventory of my assets, a detailed assessment of what would eventually come her way. "Mom, you've accumulated so much over the years," she said in that patronizing tone she'd perfected. "Some of those old boxes in the attic haven't been touched in decades. We could go through everything together, maybe donate some items you don't need anymore, and make sure the important things are properly stored and documented." Documented? There was that word again, the one that made my teeth clench. I agreed to the visit, curious to see just how far this treasure-hunting expedition would go. When Jennifer arrived the following Saturday with Marcus in tow, they came, armed with clipboards, a digital camera, and several large plastic storage containers. They'd clearly planned this operation with military precision. "We brought some organizational supplies," Marcus announced, hefting a box of labels and file folders. "Figured we could set up a proper system for cataloging everything." He said it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered a particularly profitable business opportunity. They started in the living room, with Jennifer photographing every piece of furniture while Marcus made notes about condition, age, and potential value. They were particularly interested in my grandmother's china cabinet, taking multiple photos from different angles and discussing whether it qualified as a genuine antique. The mahogany dining table that had hosted countless family meals became a subject of intense scrutiny, with Marcus running his hands along the wood grain and speculating about its craftsmanship and market appeal. "This is really beautiful, Mom," Jennifer said, though her tone suggested she was evaluating a piece at an auction rather than admiring a family heirloom. "Have you ever had it appraised? Furniture like this could be worth quite a bit if it's authentic period piece." I watched them work their way through my home like professional estate assessors, noting the silver tea service my mother had given me as a wedding gift, the Persian rug I'd bought during a deployment in the Middle East, the collection of military books that represented decades of professional study and personal interest. Every item was photographed, evaluated, and mentally cataloged for future reference. The most disturbing moment came when they reached my bedroom. I'd always considered this my private sanctuary, the one space in the house that was purely mine. But Jennifer walked in without hesitation, immediately gravitating toward my jewelry box and the antique vanity where I kept my most personal items. "Oh, Mom, I'd forgotten about this beautiful vanity," she said, running her fingers across the intricate woodwork. "This was great-grandmother's, wasn't it? The mirror still has such a clear reflection after all these years." She was already taking pictures, adjusting angles to capture the craftsmanship and detail. Marcus focused on my closet, where I kept several items from my military career. He seemed particularly interested in my dress uniform, still pristine in its garment bag and the wooden display case that held my medals and commendations. "Ruth, these military collectibles can be quite valuable," he said, lifting the case to examine it more closely. Especially with your service record. Have you thought about what you want to do with them? The question hung in the air like a threat. What I wanted to do with them was keep them, obviously. They represented 22 years of my life, achievements I'd earned through dedication and sacrifice. But Marcus was clearly thinking in terms of monetary value, calculating their worth in the collector's market rather than their personal significance to me. Sarah arrived later that afternoon with Emma, ostensibly to help with the organization project. But I noticed immediately that Sarah gravitated toward specific items: the jewelry collection, the silver pieces, the antique furniture, while showing little interest in the boxes of photographs, books, or personal mementos that actually told the story of my life. "Mom, you really should have all of this properly insured," Sarah said, holding up a silver serving tray that had belonged to my grandmother. "If something happened to the house, if there was a fire or a break-in, you could lose everything. Have you updated your homeowner's policy recently?" The suggestion seemed practical on the surface, but I understood the subtext. She wanted me to get everything appraised and insured not for my protection, but to establish documented values for inheritance purposes. She was building a paper trail that would make the eventual distribution of assets smoother and more efficient. Emma was the only one who seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the objects. When she found a box of letters I'd written home during my deployments, she sat cross-legged on the floor reading them with fascination. "Grandma Ruth, you were so brave," she said after reading about a particularly difficult mission in Afghanistan. "Were you scared when you had to do all these dangerous things?" Before I could answer, Sarah intervened. "Emma, honey, those letters are probably private. Why don't you help us with the jewelry instead? We need to make sure everything is properly organized." The dismissal was swift and telling. Sarah had no interest in preserving the stories of my military service, the experiences that had shaped my character and values. She wanted Emma focused on the valuable items, the tangible assets that would someday be distributed among the family. The letters, with their accounts of courage, sacrifice, and service, were irrelevant to her agenda. As the day progressed, I began to notice a pattern in their organization efforts. Items with obvious monetary value were carefully photographed, measured, and cataloged. Items with only sentimental value, photo albums, personal letters, books, small mementos from my travels, were relegated to donation piles or deemed unnecessary clutter. "Mom, do you really need all these old books?" Jennifer asked, gesturing toward my collection of military history and biography volumes. "Most of this information is probably available online now. We could donate these to make room for more important things." More important things. Like the china sets and silver pieces that could be appraised and divided. Like the jewelry that could be distributed according to value. Like the furniture that could be sold or inherited based on market worth. My books, which represented a lifetime of learning and intellectual curiosity, were just taking up valuable space that could be better utilized for storing financial assets. Marcus had brought a small notebook where he discreetly jotted down observations about various items. I caught glimpses of his notes over his shoulder. Dining table, solid mahogany, good condition, Stein 2 to 3K. China cabinet, needs appraisal, possibly antique. Bedroom vanity, ornate, likely valuable. He was conducting a professional assessment, disguised as family assistants. The most chilling moment came when they discovered my safe deposit box key in my jewelry box. I'd kept it there for years, never thinking anyone would go through my personal belongings so thoroughly. But Jennifer found it immediately, holding it up with obvious excitement. "Mom, I didn't know you had a safe deposit box. What do you keep? In there?" Her voice was casual, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "Important documents? More jewelry? We should probably make sure I have access to it. You know, just in case something happens to you. Just in case something happens to you." The phrase had become their universal justification for inserting themselves into every aspect of my financial life. They weren't planning for my death, they assured me. They were just being responsible, thinking ahead, making sure everything would be properly handled during my theoretical future incapacity. I told them the safe deposit box contained important documents and a few valuable items, but I didn't elaborate. The truth was, it held some of my most precious possessions. The original letters my father had written to my mother during World War II, the Purple Heart he'd been awarded posthumously, the engagement ring he'd given her before shipping overseas. These weren't items with significant monetary value, but they were irreplaceable family artifacts that connected me to a history of service and sacrifice. But watching Jennifer's face, I realized she was already imagining the contents in terms of inheritance distribution. She probably assumed the box contained additional jewelry, stock certificates, or cash that hadn't been accounted for in her mental inventory. The idea that it might hold items of purely sentimental value seemed not to occur to her. By the end of the day, they'd photographed and cataloged nearly everything in my house of any conceivable value. They'd created detailed lists, taken measurements, and made notes about condition and potential worth. They'd also filled several boxes with items they'd convinced me to donate, mostly books, clothing, and personal mementos that couldn't be easily monetized. "This was so productive, Mom," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "Now you know exactly what you have and everything is properly organized. We should do this for the attic and basement too, maybe next month." The basement and attic. Of course. They weren't finished cataloging my assets. There were still unexplored territories in my own home, still potential treasures that hadn't been identified and evaluated. I was beginning to feel like an archaeological site being systematically excavated by treasure hunters. That evening, after they'd all gone home, I sat in my newly organized living room and felt like a stranger in my own house. Everything looked the same, but it felt different somehow. Violated. My personal belongings had been reduced to inventory items, my lifetime of memories transformed into a collection of assets awaiting distribution. Rex seemed to sense my distress. He positioned himself at my feet, his warm weight against my legs, providing the only genuine comfort I'd felt all day. Unlike my family, he had no interest in my possessions, no agenda beyond wanting to be near me. His loyalty was pure, uncomplicated by financial considerations or inheritance planning. I pulled out the notebook Marcus had accidentally left behind, flipping through pages of his meticulous notes. Each room of my house had been evaluated like a retail space, with estimates of value and observations about marketability. He'd even made notes about which items would be easy to sell versus which might require specialized auction houses or estate sale companies. The final page contained what appeared to be a rough calculation of my total assets based on his estimates. Furniture, jewelry, collectibles, silver, artwork, everything had been assigned a monetary value and totaled at the bottom of the page. Seeing my life reduced to a dollar amount was like reading my own obituary while still alive. But what disturbed me most wasn't the financial calculation. It was the complete absence of any recognition that these items had meaning beyond their market value. Marcus had noted the condition of my grandmother's china, but shown no interest in the story of how she'd carried it across the ocean as a young immigrant. He'd assessed the value of my military medals but expressed no curiosity about the actions that had earned them. To him, and apparently to my daughters, I was simply a woman with a valuable collection of assets who was inconveniently still alive and in control of their distribution. They were waiting for me to die, or at least become incapacitated enough to require their management of my affairs. In the meantime, they were conducting reconnaissance missions disguised as family visits, gathering intelligence for the eventual takeover of my estate. I thought about all the items they'd photographed and cataloged, each one representing a piece of my history, my relationships, my achievements. My mother's engagement ring, earned through a lifetime of love and devotion. My grandmother's silver tea service, polished and used for special occasions throughout my childhood. The Persian rug I'd bought with my first major's salary, a symbol of my financial independence and professional success. These weren't just valuable objects. They were the tangible evidence of lives well lived, relationships cherished, and accomplishments earned through hard work and sacrifice. But my family saw only dollar signs and inheritance opportunities. They'd turned my home into a showroom and my possessions into a catalog of future acquisitions. The woman who'd commanded soldiers and navigated complex military operations was being treated like an incompetent elderly person whose primary value lay in her accumulated assets. They spoke to me with the patronizing kindness reserved for someone whose mental capacity was already in question, whose autonomy was temporary and soon to be transferred to more capable hands. But I was far from incompetent, and my mental capacity was sharp enough to recognize exactly what was happening. They'd revealed their true priorities with stunning clarity, and I'd finally stopped making excuses for their behavior. The evidence was documented in Marcus's notebook, photographed in their digital files, and demonstrated in their systematic evaluation of my life's accumulation. I was no longer a person to them. I was a portfolio to be managed. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday in February, when I discovered Sarah had been showing potential buyers through my house without my knowledge. I'd returned early from my physical therapy appointment due to a canceled session, pulling into my driveway to find a sleek black sedan parked on the street and two well-dressed strangers standing on my front porch with Sarah, who was holding what appeared to be house keys. My house keys. I sat in my car for a moment, rain drumming against the windshield, watching this surreal scene unfold. Sarah was gesturing toward the bay windows, speaking animatedly to the couple while occasionally consulting a folder of papers. The woman had a measuring tape in her hands, and the man was taking notes on a tablet. They weren't casual visitors or friends. They were clearly evaluating my property with professional interest. When Sarah spotted my car, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Surprise, guilt, panic, and finally a forced smile as she waved cheerfully and started walking toward me. The couple remained on the porch, looking awkward and uncertain about whether they should leave or continue their assessment. "Mom," Sarah called out as I slowly got out of my car, my knee protesting the sudden movement. "You're back early. I was going to call you about this." She was speaking too quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush that immediately confirmed my worst suspicions. "Call me about what exactly?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. The tone was one I'd perfected during my military career, the deceptively quiet voice that preceded serious consequences for subordinates who'd overstepped their authority. Sarah glanced nervously toward the couple on my porch, clearly calculating how much she could reveal in front of witnesses. "Well, you know how you've mentioned wanting to downsize eventually? I thought it might be helpful to get an informal assessment of the house's value, just so you'd have that information when you're ready to make decisions. An informal assessment, with strangers who had measuring tapes and professional evaluation materials, with people who were clearly real estate professionals rather than casual observers. And Sarah had somehow acquired keys to my house, keys I'd never given her to facilitate this informal evaluation. "And where did you get the keys to my house?" I asked, stepping closer to her. Rain was beginning to soak through my jacket, but I was too focused on her answer to care about the weather. Sarah's face flushed red. "Well, I made copies a while back, just for emergencies, in case something happened and you needed help." I was going to tell you, but there never seemed to be a good time to bring it up. Just for emergencies. Like the emergency of needing to show my house to potential buyers without my knowledge or consent. Like the emergency of conducting real estate evaluations while I was conveniently away at medical appointments. The violation felt like a physical blow. The realization that my own daughter had been operating behind my back with duplicate keys and secret agendas. The woman on the porch cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should reschedule this. For another time," she suggested, her professional instincts telling her she'd walked into a family conflict that could potentially complicate any future business relationship. "No, please stay," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking command of difficult situations. "I'd like to understand exactly what kind of assessment you're conducting on my property." The woman introduced herself as Linda Chen from Premium Properties, a high-end real estate agency that specialized in estate sales and property transitions for mature clients. Her partner was David Rodriguez, a certified property appraiser who worked with families planning for life changes and estate management. The euphemisms were carefully chosen, designed to make the process sound respectful and considerate rather than predatory, but I understood exactly what they meant. They specialized in pressuring elderly homeowners to sell valuable properties, often working with family members who were eager to liquidate assets for immediate financial benefit. "Your daughter contacted our office last month," Linda explained, consulting her folder. "She mentioned that you were considering downsizing and wanted to understand your options. We specialize in helping families navigate these transitions with minimal stress and maximum value preservation." Last month. Sarah had been planning this for weeks, possibly longer. She'd researched real estate agencies, made initial contact, scheduled this evaluation, and acquired copies of my house keys, all without a single conversation with me about my actual intentions or timeline for any potential move. "And what exactly have you determined about my property?" I asked, genuinely curious about how thoroughly they'd assessed my home during my absence. David consulted his tablet, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but professionally obligated to provide the information he'd gathered. "Based on our preliminary evaluation, your property is valued at approximately $485,000 to $520,000, depending on market conditions and the timing of any potential sale. The location is excellent, the structure is sound, and the lot size is quite attractive to buyers in this market segment. $500,000. Sarah had been walking through my house with strangers, calculating how much money my home was worth, and presumably planning how those proceeds might benefit her own financial situation. The house where I'd lived for over a decade, where I'd created a peaceful retirement sanctuary, had been reduced to a market valuation and profit potential. The interior is beautifully maintained," Linda added, apparently trying to lighten the mood with compliments. "Your furniture and decorative items are quite lovely, very tasteful. Some buyers really appreciate properties that come with quality furnishings already in place." Quality furnishings. She was referring to my grandmother's antiques, my mother's china collection, my carefully curated lifetime of meaningful objects. In her professional assessment, these weren't family heirlooms with emotional significance. They were staging elements that could increase the property's appeal to potential buyers. Sarah was shifting nervously from foot to foot, clearly realizing that her secret evaluation had backfired spectacularly. "Mom, I know this looks bad, but I was really just trying to help. I thought having this information would be useful for your planning." "My planning," I repeated slowly. "What planning would that be, Sarah? When exactly did I ask you to research real estate values or schedule property assessments?" The question hung in the air while Sarah struggled to find an answer that wouldn't further incriminate her. She couldn't claim I'd asked her to do this because we both knew it was a lie. She couldn't pretend it was a surprise or gift because the professional nature of the evaluation made it clear this was a serious business inquiry. "Well, you've mentioned wanting to simplify your life," she finally said, grasping for any justification that might sound reasonable. "And with your health issues, I thought maybe having options would be good for you." My health issues. Another manipulation tactic, suggesting that my physical limitations made me incapable of managing my own living situation. Yes, I had chronic pain from my military service. Yes, maintaining a large house was sometimes challenging. But I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions about when and if to move, and I certainly didn't need my daughter conducting secret real estate transactions on my behalf. Linda and David were clearly eager to escape this family drama, but I wasn't ready to let them leave quite yet. I'm curious about your process, I said to Linda. When adult children contact you about their parents' properties, do you typically tour the homes without the owner's knowledge? Linda's professional composure slipped slightly. Well, usually we prefer to meet with all parties involved in the decision-making process. In this case, your daughter indicated that you were interested, but preferred to have preliminary information before committing to a formal evaluation. Another lie. Sarah had never asked me about preliminary information or formal evaluations. She'd never mentioned contacting real estate agents or property appraisers. This entire operation had been conducted without my knowledge because she'd known I would never have agreed to it. And did my daughter mention any specific timeline for a potential sale? I continued, watching Sarah's face grow paler with each question. David checked his notes. She indicated that you were hoping to make a decision within the next 6 to 12 months, possibly sooner if the right opportunity presented itself. 6 to 12 months. Sarah had not only scheduled a property evaluation. Without my consent, she'd provided a fictional timeline for my decision-making process. She'd told these professionals that I was actively planning to sell my house within the year, creating expectations and potential business relationships based on complete fabrications. The rain was falling harder now, and Linda was clearly ready to end this uncomfortable encounter. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting when everyone has had a chance to discuss this privately, she suggested diplomatically. That won't be necessary, I said firmly. I'm not interested in selling my house, and I certainly won't be working with any real estate professionals who conduct business without the property owner's knowledge or consent. Please remove my address from your files and don't contact my family about this property again. Linda nodded quickly, clearly relieved to have a clear directive that would allow her to escape this situation. Of course, we'll update our records immediately. Thank you for your time. She and David hurried to their car, leaving Sarah and me standing in my driveway in the rain. The silence stretched between us as I waited for Sarah to offer some explanation or apology that might make sense of what I'd just witnessed. But she stood there looking sullen and defensive, like a teenager caught breaking curfew rather than an adult who'd just violated my privacy and autonomy in the most fundamental way possible. How long have you been planning this? I asked finally. Sarah crossed her arms, rain dripping from her hair. Mom, you're making this into something much bigger than it is. I was just gathering information. I wasn't going to force you to sell anything, just gathering information about my property values, my potential selling timeline, my living situation, and future plans. Information she'd gathered by hiring professionals, providing false timelines, and using duplicate keys to access my home without permission. The casual way she dismissed the violation made it clear she didn't understand, or didn't care, how completely she'd betrayed my trust. Where did you really get the keys, Sarah? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I took your spare set from the kitchen drawer last month when I was here for dinner. I was going to put them back before you noticed. Last month, during one of our regular family dinners, while I'd been cooking and serving her favorite meal, she'd been stealing my house keys to facilitate secret real estate evaluations. The premeditation was breathtaking. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a momentary lapse in judgment. She'd planned and executed a deliberate campaign to gather information about my property without my knowledge. And Jennifer knows about this? Sarah's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. We've talked about your situation, yes. We're both concerned about your ability to maintain this big house as you get older. We just want to make sure you have good information when you're ready to make decisions. We've talked about your situation. My daughters had been having discussions about my living arrangements, my capabilities, my future plans, and my property values. They'd been making decisions about what was best for me, conducting research on my behalf, and taking actions to advance their agenda, all without including me in the conversation. I walked past Sarah toward my front door, fishing my own keys from my purse. I want those duplicate keys back. Now. Sarah reluctantly produced my keys from her jacket pocket, dropping them into my outstretched palm. Mom, I'm sorry this upset you. I really was just trying to help. Trying to help. By violating my privacy, lying to real estate professionals, and conducting secret evaluations of my property. By stealing my keys and using them to facilitate unauthorized access to my home. By discussing my personal business with her sister and making plans for my future without consulting me. Help with what exactly? I asked, turning to face her. Help me sell my house faster? Help you and Jennifer calculate your inheritance? Help strangers evaluate my property so you'll know what it's worth when I die? Sarah's face crumpled as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair, Mom. We don't want you to die. We just want to make sure you're safe and comfortable. Safe and comfortable. In a smaller house that would be easier to maintain, with fewer possessions to worry about, with simplified finances that would be easier for them to manage when the time came. Their definition of safety and comfort involved reducing my autonomy, liquidating my assets, and preparing for their eventual inheritance of whatever remained. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, not inviting Sarah to follow. I need you to leave now, and I need you to understand that my house, my property, and my future plans are not subjects for family discussion or evaluation without my direct involvement. Sarah stood in my doorway, rain-soaked and miserable, looking like she wanted to argue but recognizing that she'd lost any moral authority to do so. Mom, please don't be angry. Can we talk about this when you've had time to think it over? Time to think it over. As if the problem was my reaction rather than her actions. As if I needed time to process the situation and would eventually come around to appreciating her unauthorized intervention in my affairs. There's nothing to think over, I said quietly. You violated my trust, invaded my privacy, and lied to professionals on my behalf. Those are facts, not misunderstandings. I closed the door before she could respond, turning the deadbolt with a firm click. Through the window, I watched her stand on my porch for several minutes, probably hoping I would reconsider and invite her back inside for the kind of emotional reconciliation she was used to receiving after her inappropriate behavior. But I'd reached a point where emotional manipulation and tearful apologies couldn't repair the fundamental damage she'd done to our relationship. She'd shown me exactly how she viewed me, as an aging woman whose decision-making capacity was questionable, whose property was family business rather than personal autonomy, whose future was theirs to plan and manage. Standing in my violated home, I realized that the woman who'd survived combat and commanded respect from seasoned soldiers had somehow allowed herself to become a passive victim in her own family. I'd been so focused on maintaining peace and family harmony that I'd failed to recognize how completely my daughters had stopped seeing me as an autonomous individual deserving of respect and basic courtesy. The reconnaissance mission was complete. They'd gathered their intelligence, assessed the value of their target, and begun implementing their strategy for eventual acquisition. All that remained was waiting for me to become sufficiently incapacitated to require their management, or sufficiently isolated to accept their decisions without resistance. But they'd made a critical miscalculation. The woman they thought they were managing was the same woman who'd made life-and-death decisions under fire, who'd earned the respect of military professionals through competence and integrity, who'd never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered. Harold was making detailed notes, clearly impressed by the comprehensive nature of the estate restructuring. Ruth, this is really extraordinary. The foundation will have significant impact, and the governance structure ensures sustainability. But I want to make sure you understand. Once these documents are signed and the foundation is established, reversing these decisions would be extremely difficult. That's exactly what I want, I replied firmly. I don't want the temptation to second-guess myself when my daughters launch their inevitable emotional campaigns to change my mind. I don't want the possibility of being manipulated back into the same patterns that got me into this situation. The irrevocable nature of the charitable trust was a feature, not a bug. It would protect me from my own potential weakness, from the family guilt trips, and tearful reconciliation attempts that had worked so effectively in the past. Once the foundation was established, my money would be legally committed to serving veterans regardless of whatever promises or apologies my daughters might offer. Harold spent the next hour walking me through every detail of the documents, ensuring I understood the implications of each decision. The house would be sold after my death, with proceeds funding the foundation's endowment. My investment accounts would transfer directly to the charitable trust. Even my car would be donated to a program that provided transportation assistance to disabled veterans. "What about personal items beyond the jewelry?" Harold asked. "Photographs, books, furniture with sentimental value?" I'd considered this carefully as well. Most of my books would go to the local library, with military history volumes donated to the Veterans Center. Furniture would be sold through estate sale, with proceeds benefiting the foundation. Photographs and personal mementos would be offered, first to Emma, with anything she didn't want going to other military families who might appreciate the historical value. "The only exception is Rex," I said, referring to my aging German shepherd who'd been my constant companion through the darkest periods of my civilian transition. "I've made arrangements with the local animal sanctuary to care for him if he outlives me, with a trust fund to cover his expenses." Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him during our meeting. "Rex gets better inheritance protection than your daughters." "Rex has earned it through loyalty and unconditional love," I replied. "He's never once looked at me and calculated what my death might be worth to him." The comparison was stark, but accurate. Rex had been with me through health scares, depression, loneliness, and the countless small challenges of aging. His presence had been purely comforting, with no agenda beyond companionship. He'd never photographed my possessions, never suggested I needed help managing my affairs, never shown interest in anything beyond my attention and affection. "There's one final component," I said, handing Harold the last document in my folder. "I want this letter delivered to Jennifer and Sarah along with copies of the new will." Harold read the letter silently, his expression growing more solemn with each paragraph. I'd spent weeks crafting the language, wanting to be clear about my reasoning without being cruel for its own sake. The letter explained exactly what behavior had led to these decisions, provided specific examples of their violations of my trust and autonomy, and outlined the values that would guide the foundation they'd chosen to forfeit. "Ruth, this is quite direct," Harold said carefully. "They deserve to understand exactly why they're receiving so little. They also deserve the opportunity to reflect on whether their treatment of other elderly family members might need to change." The letter served multiple purposes beyond simply explaining my decisions. It established a clear record of their behavior in case they attempted to contest the will or claim I'd been incompetent when making these changes. It also sent a message to other family members and friends who might question my judgment, providing detailed documentation of the systematic exploitation I'd endured. Most importantly, it gave Jennifer and Sarah the chance to learn from their mistakes, even if that learning came too late to benefit them financially. Perhaps seeing the consequences of their actions would prompt them to treat their own children differently, to value relationships over assets, to understand that love and respect couldn't be inherited, but had to be earned through consistent demonstration. Harold gathered all the documents into neat stacks, preparing them for final review and execution. "When would you like to schedule the signing?" "Today," I said without hesitation. "I want everything finalized before I have any second thoughts or external pressure to reconsider." Harold checked his calendar and nodded. "I can have the documents prepared for execution this afternoon. Do you want to notify your daughters about these changes, or would you prefer they learn about them after?" "They'll learn about it when the will is read," I interrupted. "Until then, this information stays confidential. I don't want to give them the opportunity to launch guilt campaigns or manipulation tactics that might undermine my resolve." The secrecy was essential to the success of my plan. If Jennifer and Sarah learned about the estate changes while I was still alive, They would undoubtedly mobilize every emotional weapon in their arsenal to change my mind. Tears, apologies, promises of reform, threats of permanent estrangement. I'd seen their manipulation playbook often enough to know exactly how they'd respond. By keeping the changes confidential until after my death, I ensured that my decisions would be final and unchangeable. They would have to live with the consequences of their choices without the possibility of negotiating a different outcome through emotional manipulation. As Harold prepared the final documents, I felt a sense of profound relief settling over me, like a warm blanket. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my own narrative, making decisions based on my values rather than my family's expectations. The woman who'd commanded troops and served her country with distinction was finally asserting that same leadership in her personal life. My legacy would honor the values I'd lived by throughout my military career: service, integrity, loyalty, and genuine care for those who'd earned it through their own actions. The foundation would continue my service long after I was gone, helping women veterans who faced the same challenges I'd overcome during my own transition to civilian life. And my daughters would learn, finally and permanently, that treating people like assets to be managed rather than individuals to be respected came with real consequences. They'd spent years calculating the value of my possessions and planning for their inheritance. Now they could calculate the cost of their behavior and plan for a future that didn't include the windfall they'd been counting on. The decision was made. The documents would be signed, and Ruth Marion Whitman would control her own story right to the very end. The next 3 weeks passed with an almost surreal normalcy as I maintained my regular routine while sitting on the biggest secret of my life. Every phone call from Jennifer, every visit from Sarah, every family interaction carried the weight of knowledge they didn't possess: that their inheritance had already been redistributed to causes that actually honored the values I'd spent a lifetime defending. Harold had executed the documents with military precision, filing the necessary paperwork to establish the Ruth Marion Whitman Foundation, and transferring legal ownership of my assets to the charitable trust. The foundation already existed, complete with board members I'd carefully selected from the veterans community, detailed bylaws governing operations, and a mission statement that reflected everything my daughters had never bothered to understand about who I really was. But maintaining the facade of normalcy required a level of performance I hadn't expected. When Jennifer called to chat about her latest shopping expedition or Marcus's promotion prospects, I had to respond with appropriate interest while knowing she was essentially talking to someone whose estate she would never inherit. When Sarah brought Emma over for their weekly visit, I had to watch my granddaughter play in a house that would soon be sold to fund scholarships and emergency assistance for veterans. The most challenging moment came when Sarah casually mentioned that she'd been looking at vacation properties online, expensive beach houses and mountain cabins that she was obviously planning to purchase with her eventual inheritance money. She showed me photographs on her phone with undisguised excitement, pointing out features like private beaches and luxury amenities, as if these fantasies were realistic future purchases, rather than dreams built on money that would never materialize. "Mom, look at this place in the Outer Banks," she said, scrolling through images of a sprawling oceanfront house with multiple decks and panoramic water views. "It's got 6 bedrooms, so there'd be plenty of space for family gatherings. And the rental income potential is incredible. We could use it as an investment property when we're not there ourselves." She was already planning how to spend my money as if it belonged to her, discussing investment strategies and family vacation logistics for assets she'd never possess. The casual assumption that my death would fund her luxury lifestyle was breathtaking in its callousness, but I maintained my composure and made appropriate noises about the property's attractive features. "Of course we wouldn't do anything like that until much later," Sarah added with transparent insincerity. "But it's nice to dream about the possibilities, you know? Much later, when I was dead and she could access the inheritance she'd been counting on." When my house was sold and my investments liquidated and my possessions distributed according to her mental calculations. She was window shopping for my legacy while I sat beside her, very much alive and increasingly convinced that every decision I'd made in Harold's office was absolutely correct. Emma provided the only genuine moments during these surreal weeks. Unlike her mother and aunt, she approached our visits with simple affection and curiosity about my stories and experiences. She'd recently started a school project about family history and genuinely wanted to learn about my military service, asking thoughtful questions about what life had been like for women in the Army during my era. "Grandma Ruth, were you scared during the dangerous missions?" she asked one afternoon as we sat in my garden, Rex sleeping peacefully at our feet. "I read that some of the places you went were really scary." I told her about the mixture of fear and determination that defined combat zones, about the importance of training and teamwork in managing dangerous situations, about the pride that came from serving something larger than yourself. Unlike her mother's perfunctory interest in my military career, Emma's questions were genuine and engaged. She wanted to understand not just what I'd done, but why it had mattered to me. "I think I might want to join the military someday," Emma said thoughtfully. "Not to fight, but maybe to help people like you did. Is that a good idea?" The question pierced through my carefully maintained emotional defenses. Here was a young woman thinking seriously about service and sacrifice, about using her life to help others rather than simply accumulating wealth and status. If she followed through on that instinct, she would understand the values that had shaped my entire adult life. She would earn any inheritance she received, rather than simply expecting it as her birthright. "Military service can be incredibly rewarding," I told her honestly, "but it requires commitment to something beyond your own immediate interests. You have to be willing to put duty before personal convenience, to care more about the mission than your own comfort." Emma nodded seriously, processing this information in a way that reminded me painfully of my own younger self. She possessed a seriousness of purpose that her mother had never demonstrated, an interest in making a meaningful contribution to the world rather than simply benefiting from other people's accomplishments. That evening, after Emma and Sarah had gone home, I called Harold to make one additional modification to the foundation documents. I wanted to establish a special provision that would provide enhanced scholarship support for Emma if she chose to pursue military service or any career focused on helping others. The girl deserved recognition for the character she was developing, regardless of her family's failures. "That's a lovely addition, Ruth," Harold said when I explained the modification. "And it provides additional incentive for her to develop the kind of values you want to see rewarded. The enhanced scholarship provision would give Emma the opportunity to earn significant educational support through her own choices and character development. If she pursued service-oriented career paths, military, social work, teaching, healthcare, or similar fields, the foundation would provide comprehensive financial assistance for her education and professional development. But if she followed her mother's example of entitlement and materialism, she would receive only the basic scholarship available to all eligible applicants. Jennifer's behavior during this period was particularly revealing. She'd started dropping by unannounced more frequently, always with some transparent excuse for the visit, but clearly conducting ongoing surveillance of my condition and possessions. She'd comment on my health with fake concern, asking leading questions about any medical appointments or changes in my routine. "Mom, you seem a little tired lately," she'd say with exaggerated worry. "Are you sure you're getting enough rest? Maybe you should consider having someone come in to help with the housework and cooking." Someone to help with housework and cooking. What she really meant was someone who could monitor my daily activities and report back about my level of independence and competence. She wanted evidence that I was becoming incapable of managing my own affairs, documentation that might support future claims about my need for assistance or guardianship. Her interest in my medical care was equally transparent. She'd started asking detailed questions about my doctor's appointments, suggesting that she should accompany me to important visits, just to make sure you understand everything the doctors are telling you. The implication that I might be too confused or forgetful to comprehend my own medical information was both insulting and strategically calculated. I read an article about how older patients sometimes miss important details during medical consultations, Jennifer explained with false helpfulness. Having a family member there to take notes can be really valuable. Older patients. She was already categorizing me as someone whose cognitive abilities were declining, whose judgment was becoming questionable, whose decision-making capacity might need to be supplemented by younger, more competent family members. The groundwork was being laid for future challenges to my autonomy, future justifications for taking control of my affairs. Marcus had his own approach to gathering intelligence about my situation. During family dinners, he'd steer conversations toward financial topics with the skill of a professional interrogator. He'd mention news stories about identity theft targeting seniors, investment scams that preyed on elderly victims, and estate planning mistakes that left families vulnerable to exploitation. "Ruth, I hope you've got good security on your financial accounts," he said during one particularly memorable dinner. "These criminals are getting really sophisticated about targeting older adults. Maybe Jennifer should be added to your accounts, just as a safety measure." Jennifer should be added to my accounts. As a safety measure, naturally. Not so she could monitor my spending or gain access to my financial information, but purely to protect me from criminals who might exploit my presumed vulnerability. The suggestion was couched in concern for my well-being, but the underlying agenda was transparent to anyone paying attention. I deflected these probes with the same diplomatic skills I'd developed during military briefings with suspicious superiors. I provided enough information to satisfy their immediate curiosity while revealing nothing substantive about my actual financial planning or estate decisions. They knew I had accounts and investments, but they had no idea that those assets were already legally committed to charitable purposes rather than family inheritance. The most surreal aspect of this period was watching them make plans based on assumptions that were completely false. Jennifer mentioned looking at new cars, obviously expecting to upgrade her vehicle once she inherited money from my estate. Sarah talked about Emma's college expenses with the confidence of someone who believed those costs would be covered by grandmother's legacy. Marcus discussed investment strategies and retirement planning that clearly factored in a significant inheritance windfall. They were building their futures on a foundation that no longer existed, making financial and personal decisions based on assets they would never possess. The foundation documents sitting in Harold's safe had already redirected their anticipated inheritance to purposes they would never support voluntarily: emergency assistance for struggling veterans, scholarships for service-oriented young people, and ongoing programs that honored military values rather than personal enrichment. During this period, I also began making discreet inquiries about veterans organizations that might benefit from the Foundation's work. I visited the local VA medical center, spoke with social workers about the most pressing needs facing women, veterans, and researched existing programs that the Foundation might supplement or expand. The conversations were both heartbreaking and inspiring. I met women who'd served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, but were now struggling with homelessness, unemployment, and medical expenses that insurance didn't cover. I learned about female veterans who'd been denied disability benefits, despite clear service-connected injuries, who'd been discriminated against in employment despite their qualifications, who'd been isolated from support systems despite their need for community. These women represented everything my daughters had never understood about real struggle and genuine need. They'd earned their benefits through service and sacrifice, but bureaucratic obstacles and social prejudices often prevented them from accessing the support they deserved. The Foundation would provide immediate, practical assistance that could make the difference between stability and crisis for veterans who'd already given so much to their country. "What you're planning sounds incredible," said Maria Santos, a social worker at the VA who specialized in women veterans issues. "Emergency financial assistance can literally save lives, preventing evictions, covering medical bills, bridging gaps between benefits. These women have earned this support, but so often they're too proud to ask for help. Maria's enthusiasm for the Foundation's mission reinforced my conviction that the money would serve purposes far more meaningful than funding my daughter's vacation houses and luxury purchases. These veterans understood sacrifice and service in ways that Jennifer and Sarah never would. They deserved support from someone who shared their values and appreciated their contributions. The Foundation board members I'd selected were equally impressive. Colonel Janet Mitchell, retired, would serve as chairman, bringing decades of experience in military administration and veterans advocacy. Dr. Patricia Wong was a psychologist specializing in PTSD treatment for female veterans. Sarah Martinez had built a successful nonprofit focused on transitional housing for homeless veterans. These women understood both the military culture and the civilian challenges that defined post-service life. Ruth, this foundation will fill critical gaps in existing support systems, Colonel Mitchell told me during one of our planning meetings. Government programs are essential, but they're often slow and bureaucratic. Emergency assistance from a private foundation can provide immediate help when veterans are facing crisis situations. The board members were also exactly the kind of women I'd hoped my daughters might become. Accomplished professionals who used their skills and resources to serve others rather than simply accumulating personal wealth. They represented the values I'd tried to instill through example, even though that example had apparently been lost on my immediate family. As the 3 weeks passed, I found myself sleeping better than I had in months. The constant underlying anxiety about my family's true motivations had been replaced by a sense of purpose and control. I was no longer a passive victim of their manipulation, no longer a resource to be managed for their benefit. I was once again the decisive leader who'd earned respect through competence and integrity. The foundation was real, legally established, and ready to begin serving veterans who would appreciate the support rather than simply expecting it as their due. My legacy would honor the principles I'd lived by throughout my military career, principles my daughters had rejected in favor of materialism and entitlement, and they had no idea what was coming. The discovery came on a Friday afternoon in early March when I returned from my weekly physical therapy appointment, to find Sarah's car in my driveway and the front door slightly ajar. I'd been running late due to traffic and had forgotten to mention my delayed schedule, assuming I'd return before she arrived for our usual coffee visit. But as I approached the house, something felt wrong. An instinctive warning that came from decades of military training and threat assessment. The front door should have been locked. Sarah had her own key now. The replacement set I'd reluctantly given her after the real estate incident, but she always knocked and waited for me to answer. Finding the door open meant either something was wrong or Sarah was inside doing something. She didn't want to explain. I entered quietly, my military instincts automatically engaging as I listened for sounds that might indicate the nature of the situation. Rex should have greeted me at the door, but instead I heard his agitated whining coming from the direction of my bedroom. Voices carried down the hallway, Sarah's voice, and another woman's voice I didn't immediately recognize. Moving carefully down the hallway, I positioned myself where I could observe without being seen. My bedroom door was wide open, and 2 women were systematically going through my personal belongings with the efficiency of professional investigators. Sarah was at my dresser, methodically opening drawers and photographing their contents with her phone. The other woman, whom I now recognized as Linda Ellis, Madison's mother from the original story's framework, was examining documents she'd removed from my jewelry box. The bank statements go back 3 years, Linda was saying, holding up papers I kept in a small wooden box that had belonged to my grandmother. She's got more in investments than I expected. The brokerage account alone shows over $400,000. $400,000. They were conducting a comprehensive financial audit of my assets, cataloging my bank statements, investment summaries, and insurance documents to establish a complete picture of what they expected to inherit. This wasn't casual snooping. This was systematic intelligence gathering with clear financial objectives. Sarah was photographing everything in my jewelry box, not just the pieces themselves, but the small cards where I'd written the history and provenance of each item. Mom keeps detailed records of where everything came from, she told Linda. Some of these pieces are worth more than I thought. This emerald necklace has an appraisal from 2019 showing $12,000. $12,000. She was quoting the insurance appraisal I'd gotten for homeowners' policy purposes, information she could only have accessed by going through my private files. They'd been through my insurance documents, my financial records, my personal correspondence, conducting a complete inventory of my estate while I was conveniently away at a medical appointment. "What about the house?" Linda asked, examining what appeared to be my property tax statements. "The assessed value keeps going up. She could easily get $500,000 if she sold in the current market. That's why we need to start talking to her about downsizing," Sarah replied, still photographing jewelry. "The sooner she moves to something smaller, the sooner we can access the equity. And honestly, this place is getting too big for her to manage anyway. Too big for me to manage." The same justification they'd used for every intrusion into my autonomy. Every attempt to accelerate my transition from independent homeowner to dependent elderly person whose assets could be more efficiently managed by younger family members. They weren't concerned about my comfort or safety. They were impatient to liquidate my property for their own financial benefit. Linda had moved to my nightstand, where she was examining documents I kept for easy reference: medical insurance, cards, emergency contact information, and a folder containing my current will. The will that still named Jennifer and Sarah as primary beneficiaries because the new estate planning documents were safely locked away in Harold's office. "She updated her will 2 years ago," Linda announced, scanning the document. "Everything's split equally between Jennifer and Sarah, with provisions for Emma's education. No mention of any charitable giving or outside organizations. No mention of charitable giving. If only they knew that their careful inventory was cataloging assets that would soon belong to the Ruth Marion Whitman Foundation for Military Veterans. If only they understood that every dollar they were counting was already committed to serving women who'd earned support through their service rather than their sense of entitlement." Sarah had finished with the jewelry box and moved to my closet, where she was examining my military uniform and the display case containing my medals and commendations. "These military things might be worth something to collectors," she mused, photographing the Purple Heart and Bronze Star I'd earned in Afghanistan. "I should research the market for this stuff. Military things. My Purple Heart, earned when an IED explosion left me with shrapnel in my back and a concussion that took months to fully heal, was military stuff with potential collector value. My Bronze Star, awarded for leadership during a mission that saved the lives of 3 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, was merchandise to be researched and potentially sold. The casual dismissal of my military service, the reduction of my sacrifices and achievements to market commodities, crystallized everything I'd come to understand about my family's values. They saw dollar signs where they should have seen honor, investment opportunities where they should have seen personal legacy, inventory items where they should have seen the tangible evidence of a life dedicated to serving something larger than personal gain. Rex's whining grew more agitated, and I realized he was trapped in the bathroom where someone had apparently shut him away to prevent interference with their search operation. My dog, who'd never shown anything but loyalty and love, was being treated as an obstacle to their reconnaissance mission in my own home. "We should wrap this up soon," Linda said, glancing at her watch. "Sarah said she usually gets back from therapy around 4:30. They'd timed this invasion of my privacy around my medical schedule, using knowledge of my routine to ensure they could conduct their search without interruption. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a moment of curiosity. This was a planned operation designed to gather comprehensive intelligence about my financial situation and estate planning." I retreated quietly to the living room, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't the first time they'd conducted this kind of search, obviously. They were too efficient, too systematic, too comfortable with the process. This was routine intelligence gathering, probably conducted every time I left the house for extended periods. The woman who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones had been outmaneuvered in her own home by family members conducting surveillance operations against her. The violation was complete and devastating, not just the invasion of my privacy, but the methodical assessment of my assets as if I were already dead, and they were conducting estate inventory. I heard them moving toward the front of the house, their mission apparently complete. Quickly, I stepped outside and made noise closing my car door, then approached the front entrance as if I'd just arrived. When I entered, Sarah was sitting casually on my sofa while Linda stood near the window, both of them projecting an air of innocent socializing that might have been convincing if I hadn't just witnessed their systematic search of my personal belongings. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said brightly, her performance flawless. "I hope you don't mind that I brought Linda over. She was asking about you, and I thought it would be nice for you two to visit." Linda smiled warmly, extending her hand in greeting. "Ruth, it's so lovely to see you again. Sarah tells me you've been doing well with your physical therapy." Physical therapy. They even knew the details of my medical treatment schedule, information they were clearly using to plan their surveillance activities. I shook Linda's hand and responded with appropriate pleasantries, while my mind processed the strategic implications of what had just occurred. They thought they were gathering intelligence for inheritance planning purposes, but they'd actually provided me with valuable information about their methods and motivations. They were conducting regular searches of my home, documenting my assets for future distribution, and coordinating their efforts to maximize their eventual financial benefit. Most importantly, they were operating under the assumption that I was unaware of their activities and incapable of mounting any effective response to their manipulation. They saw me as a passive target rather than an active adversary, a critical miscalculation that would work to my advantage when the time came for consequences. "Linda was just saying how much she admires this house," Sarah continued, still maintaining her casual tone. "The architecture is so beautiful, and the location is perfect. The architecture and location that affected property values and resale potential." Linda's admiration was purely financial, focused on the market appeal of assets she expected her family to inherit through Madison's marriage to my son Eric. Even the extended family network was evaluating my property for eventual liquidation purposes. "It's been a wonderful home," I replied carefully, "though I sometimes wonder if it's becoming too much for me to maintain properly." The statement was calculated to see how they would respond to any suggestion that I might be considering changes to my living situation. Both women immediately perked up with interest, their casual demeanor sharpening into focused attention. "Oh, Mom, you've maintained this place beautifully," Sarah said quickly. "But if you ever did want to simplify things, we could help you explore your options. The market is really strong right now for properties like this. The market is really strong." She was ready with current real estate information, obviously having researched property values in anticipation of my eventual decision to sell. She wanted to position herself as helpful and supportive while actually encouraging me to liquidate my assets for her benefit. Linda nodded enthusiastically. "Downsizing can be so liberating for people at your stage of life. Less maintenance, lower expenses, more flexibility to travel and enjoy retirement. More flexibility to travel and enjoy retirement, while my house sale proceeds sat in bank accounts earning interest for my eventual heirs." The suggestion was wrapped in concern for my quality of life, but the underlying message was clear. Sell the house, liquidate the equity, and make those assets available for inheritance distribution. We chatted for another 30 minutes, during which they continued probing for information about my financial planning and future intentions. They asked about my health, my comfort level with house maintenance, my thoughts about retirement living options, and my general satisfaction with my current situation. Every question was designed to elicit information that might indicate my readiness to make changes that would benefit their financial planning. After they left, I immediately went to my bedroom to assess exactly what they'd accessed during their search. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. Drawers not quite closed in their original positions. Papers not quite returned to their exact locations. My jewelry box showing signs of having been moved and repositioned. Most disturbing was the realization that they'd photographed not just my jewelry and financial documents, but also personal letters and family photographs that had no monetary value. They were building a comprehensive dossier of my life, my relationships, my assets, and my personal history. This was intelligence gathering at a level that suggested long-term strategic planning, rather than casual curiosity about inheritance prospects. Marcus was frantically reading through the financial documents, calculating the magnitude of what they'd just lost. "Ruth, this can't be legal. You can't just disinherit your own family for a charity. This has to be some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake," Harold interjected professionally. "Mrs. Whitman has executed comprehensive estate planning documents that are entirely legal and binding. The foundation has been properly established, and all assets have been legally transferred to the charitable trust." Sarah was staring at the big documents with the expression of someone watching a house fire consume everything they owned. "Mom, I don't understand. Why would you do this to us? We're your family. We love you." "Do you?" I asked quietly. "Because love looks very different from what I've experienced from this family over the past several years." I moved to the dining room table where Harold had arranged the evidence I'd been collecting for months. Photographs they'd taken of my possessions during their unauthorized visits. Copies of the real estate evaluation documents Sarah had commissioned without my knowledge. Marcus's notebook with his detailed asset calculations and estimated values of my belongings. "Love doesn't involve stealing house keys to conduct secret property evaluations," I continued, holding up the real estate paperwork. "Love doesn't involve systematically photographing someone's possessions to create inheritance inventories. Love doesn't involve shutting an elderly woman's dog in the bathroom while you search through her private papers and financial documents." Jennifer's face went white. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain what? How you and Sarah have been conducting surveillance operations in my home? How you've been timing your visits around my medical appointments to ensure you could search my belongings without interference? How you've been treating me like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected?" I pulled out the photographs they'd taken of my jewelry, my furniture, my military memorabilia. "Explain how taking pictures of my Purple Heart and Bronze Star to research their collector value demonstrates the love and respect you claim to feel for me." Sarah started crying, but they were the tears of someone who'd lost a lottery ticket rather than someone genuinely sorry for causing pain. "Mom, we were just trying to help. We wanted to make sure everything was properly organized for the future." "Whose future?" I demanded. "Because it certainly wasn't mine. You've been planning for my death since the day I mentioned retirement, calculating the value of my possessions and organizing my life around your inheritance expectations." Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding and obvious discomfort. At 14, she was old enough to recognize the greed and manipulation that had been hidden from her, but naive enough to be genuinely shocked by her family's behavior. "Mom, Aunt Jennifer, you guys really did all that stuff?" Emma asked, looking between her mother and aunt with disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation I could have made. Neither of them could answer her directly. "How do you explain to a child that you've been stealing from her grandmother, lying about your motivations, and treating her like inventory to be liquidated? How do you justify treating an elderly family member like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished? The foundation will provide emergency assistance to women veterans who are struggling with housing, medical bills, and educational expenses," I continued, returning to my position near the fireplace. "It will fund scholarships for young people who demonstrate the values of service and integrity that you've chosen to reject." "What about Emma?" Sarah asked desperately. "You're punishing her for our mistakes. That's not fair." Emma will have opportunities to earn support through her own character and choices, I replied, looking directly at my granddaughter. There's a scholarship program specifically for granddaughters of veterans who pursue education and service-oriented careers. If she develops the integrity and values that you've failed to demonstrate, she'll benefit from my legacy in ways that actually honor its purpose. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that her grandmother was offering her something her mother and aunt had forfeited, the chance to earn respect and support through her own actions rather than simply inheriting it through family connections. But, Mom, Jennifer said, her voice breaking, we're your daughters? Doesn't that mean anything to you? It means you had every opportunity to demonstrate love, respect, and genuine concern for my well-being, I replied. Instead, you chose to see me as a collection of assets awaiting distribution. You chose to violate my privacy, manipulate my emotions, and plan for my death rather than cherish my life. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to salvage their situation. Ruth, you're making this decision while you're emotional about the cancer diagnosis. Maybe you should take more time to think about this rationally. I made these decisions before my cancer diagnosis, I said calmly. The foundation was established 3 weeks ago after months of careful consideration and planning. The cancer simply confirmed that my timeline was realistic and my decisions were correct. Harold began collecting the documents, his professional demeanor unchanged despite the emotional chaos surrounding him. I should mention that Mrs. Whitman has also revised her medical directives and power of attorney designations. All decision-making authority now rests with designated representatives from the veterans community rather than family members. The final blow. They'd lost not just their inheritance, but also any legal authority to make decisions about my care if I became incapacitated. I'd transferred that responsibility to people who understood military values and would respect my wishes rather than their own financial interests. You can't do this to us, Sarah sobbed. We have families, responsibilities, expenses. We were counting on your help. You were counting on my death, I corrected. And you were so busy planning for that eventuality that you forgot to appreciate my life. The meeting ended with Jennifer and Sarah storming out, their tears mixed with rage and disbelief. Marcus followed them, muttering threats about legal challenges and family loyalty that rang hollow after everything that had been revealed. Only Emma lingered, approaching me with the maturity of someone much older than her 14 years. Grandma, Ruth, I'm sorry they treated you that way, she said quietly. I didn't know they were doing those things. That's really awful. Thank you, sweetheart, I replied, hugging her tightly. Remember that respect and love are earned through actions, not inherited through blood. Your mother and aunt forgot that lesson, but you don't have to make the same mistake. Emma nodded solemnly. If I work really hard and help people like you did, will I still be able to learn about our family history? About the jewelry and the stories behind everything? The jewelry that matters most will wait for you until you're 21, I assured her. And the stories will always be yours if you prove worthy of hearing them. After everyone left, Harold, and I sat in my quiet living room, Rex peacefully sleeping at my feet, the late afternoon sun streaming through windows that no longer felt violated by unwelcome surveillance. How do you feel, Ruth? Harold asked. Marcus was frantically reading through the financial documents, calculating the magnitude of what they'd just lost. Ruth, this can't be legal. You can't just disinherit your own family for a charity. This has to be some kind of mistake. There's no mistake, Harold interjected professionally. Mrs. Whitman has executed comprehensive estate planning documents that are entirely legal and binding. The foundation has been properly established, and all assets have been legally transferred to the charitable trust. Sarah was staring at the big documents with the expression of someone watching a house fire consume everything they owned. Mom, I don't understand. Why would you do this to us? We're your family. We love you. Do you? I asked quietly. Because love looks very different from what I've experienced from this family over the past several years. I moved to the dining room table where Harold had arranged the evidence I'd been collecting for months, photographs they'd taken of my possessions during their unauthorized visits, copies of the real estate evaluation documents Sarah had commissioned without my knowledge, Marcus's notebook with his detailed asset calculations and estimated values of my belongings. Love doesn't involve stealing house keys to conduct secret property evaluations, I continued, holding up the real estate paperwork. Love doesn't involve systematically photographing someone's possessions to create inheritance inventories. Love doesn't involve shutting an elderly woman's dog in the bathroom while you search through her private papers and financial documents. Jennifer's face went white. Mom, I can explain. Explain what? How you and Sarah have been conducting surveillance operations in my home? How you've been timing your visits around my medical appointments to ensure you could search my belongings without interference? How you've been treating me like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected? I pulled out the photographs they'd taken of my jewelry, my furniture, my military memorabilia. Explain how taking pictures of my Purple Heart and Bronze Star to research their collector value demonstrates the love and respect you claim to feel for me. Sarah started crying, but they were the tears of someone who'd lost a lottery ticket rather than someone genuinely sorry for causing pain. Mom, we were just trying to help. We wanted to make sure everything was properly organized for the future. Whose future? I demanded. Because it certainly wasn't mine. You've been planning for my death since the day I mentioned retirement, calculating the value of my possessions and organizing my life around your inheritance expectations. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding and obvious discomfort. At 14, she was old enough to recognize the greed and manipulation that had been hidden from her, but naive enough to be genuinely shocked by her family's behavior. Mom, Aunt Jennifer, you guys really did all that stuff? Emma asked, looking between her mother and aunt with disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation I could have made. Neither of them could answer her directly. How do you explain to a child that you've been stealing from her grandmother, lying about your motivations, and treating her like inventory to be liquidated? How do you justify treating an elderly family member like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished? The foundation will provide emergency assistance to women veterans who are struggling with housing, medical bills, and educational expenses, I continued, returning to my position near the fireplace. It will fund scholarships for young people who demonstrate the values of service and integrity that you've chosen to reject. What about Emma? Sarah asked desperately. You're punishing her for our mistakes. That's not fair. Emma will have opportunities to earn support through her own character and choices, I replied, looking directly at my granddaughter. There's a scholarship program specifically for granddaughters of veterans who pursue education and service-oriented careers. If she develops the integrity and values that you've failed to demonstrate, she'll benefit from my legacy in ways that actually honor its purpose. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that her grandmother was offering her something her mother and aunt had forfeited, the chance to earn respect and support through her own actions rather than simply inheriting it through family connections. But, Mom, Jennifer said, her voice breaking, we're your daughters? Doesn't that mean anything to you? It means you had every opportunity to demonstrate love, respect, and genuine concern for my well-being, I replied. Instead, you chose to see me as a collection of assets awaiting distribution. You chose to violate my privacy, manipulate my emotions, and plan for my death rather than cherish my life. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to salvage their situation. Ruth, you're making this decision while you're emotional about the cancer diagnosis. Maybe you should take more time to think about this rationally. I made these decisions before my cancer diagnosis, I said calmly. The foundation was established 3 weeks ago, after months of careful consideration and planning. The cancer simply confirmed that my timeline was realistic and my decisions were correct. Harold began collecting the documents, his professional demeanor unchanged despite the emotional chaos surrounding him. I should mention that Mrs. Whitman has also revised her medical directives and power of attorney designations. All decision-making authority now rests with designated representatives from the veterans community rather than family members. The final blow. They'd lost not just their inheritance, but also any legal authority to make decisions about my care if I became incapacitated. I'd transferred that responsibility to people who understood military values and would respect my wishes rather than their own financial interests. "You can't do this to us," Sarah sobbed. "We have families, responsibilities, expenses. We were counting on your help." "You were counting on my death," I corrected. "And you were so busy planning for that eventuality that you forgot to appreciate my life." The meeting ended with Jennifer and Sarah storming out, their tears mixed with rage and disbelief. Marcus followed them, muttering threats about legal challenges and family loyalty that rang hollow after everything that had been revealed. Only Emma lingered, approaching me with the maturity of someone much older than her 14 years. "Grandma, Ruth, I'm sorry they treated you that way," she said quietly. "I didn't know they were doing those things. That's really awful." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, hugging her tightly. "Remember that respect and love are earned through actions, not inherited through blood. Your mother and aunt forgot that lesson, but you don't have to make the same mistake." Emma nodded solemnly. "If I work really hard and help people like you did, will I still be able to learn about our family history? About the jewelry and the stories behind everything?" "The jewelry that matters most will wait for you until you're 21, I assured her. "And the stories will always be yours if you prove worthy of hearing them." After everyone left, Harold and I sat in my quiet living room, Rex peacefully sleeping at my feet, the late afternoon sun streaming through windows that no longer felt violated by unwelcome surveillance. "How do you feel, Ruth?" Harold asked. Rex was indeed shut in the bathroom, released when I opened the door to find him agitated and confused by his confinement. Someone had deliberately isolated him to prevent interference with their search operation, treating my loyal companion as an obstacle to be managed rather than a beloved pet deserving of respect. That evening, I called Harold to schedule an emergency meeting. The systematic invasion of my privacy, the detailed cataloging of my assets, and the coordinated nature of their intelligence gathering had accelerated my timeline for implementing the final phase of my estate planning strategy. "Harold, they've been conducting regular searches of my home," I explained. "They know about every asset, every investment, every piece of valuable property. They're building detailed inventories for inheritance planning purposes." Harold was silent for several moments, processing the implications. "Ruth, if they're conducting that level of surveillance, they might also be monitoring your communications or financial activities. We should move quickly to ensure all your estate planning documents are properly secured." The suggestion that they might be monitoring my communications sent a chill down my spine. If they had access to my phone records, email accounts, or banking information, they could potentially discover the foundation establishment and take action to contest or challenge the estate planning changes before my death. "I want to accelerate our timeline," I told Harold. "And I want to ensure that all foundation documents are completely secure from any potential interference." Harold agreed to meet the following Monday to review security protocols and discuss additional measures to protect the integrity of my estate planning decisions. The war for control of my legacy had escalated beyond anything I'd anticipated, but the woman who'd commanded troops under fire was more than capable of outmaneuvering family members who'd underestimated their opponent. The intelligence gathering worked both ways. Now I knew exactly how systematically they were planning to exploit my death for their financial benefit. And they had no idea that their careful inventory was cataloging assets that would never belong to them. The element of surprise was entirely mine, and I intended to use it decisively. The final confrontation came sooner than I'd planned, triggered by a phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when Dr. Patricia Williams from the VA Medical Center called with news that would accelerate my timeline dramatically. "Ruth, I'm calling about your recent test results," Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying that particular tone medical professionals use when delivering serious news. "We've found some irregularities that require immediate attention. I need you to come in for additional testing as soon as possible." The irregularities turned out to be early-stage cancer, caught fortunately in time for treatment, but serious enough to force me to confront my own mortality in very practical terms. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had been conducting surveillance operations to catalog my assets for their eventual inheritance, my body had been developing the very condition that would make those inheritance plans relevant sooner than anyone expected. But instead of panic or despair, I felt an odd sense of relief. The diagnosis gave me clarity about what needed to happen next, and more importantly, it gave me the perfect opportunity to reveal my true estate planning to my family while I was still alive to witness their reactions. I scheduled the family meeting for the following Saturday, telling Jennifer and Sarah only that I had important news to share about my health and my plans for the future. I didn't mention the cancer diagnosis specifically, wanting to control the flow of information and their emotional responses. Harold arrived 30 minutes before my family, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would transform my living room into the scene of the most dramatic inheritance revelation in our family's history. We arranged the papers on my dining room table like exhibits in a courtroom, each document representing another aspect of the comprehensive estate restructuring I'd completed over the past month. "Are you ready for this, Ruth?" Harold asked as we heard cars pulling into my driveway. "Once we begin this process, there's no going back to the way things were. Harold, there's been no going back since Christmas morning when I watched them mentally divide my jewelry like pirates splitting treasure," I replied. "Today they're going to learn what respect actually costs." Jennifer arrived first with Marcus, both of them clearly anxious about the mysterious family meeting I'd called. Sarah followed with Emma, who looked confused about why her grandmother had summoned the entire family for what seemed like a serious discussion. They settled into my living room with the uncomfortable energy of people expecting bad news, but hoping it wouldn't affect them personally. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing near the fireplace where I could see everyone's faces clearly. "I've asked Harold to join us today because I have some important information to share about my health and my estate planning." The mention of estate planning immediately sharpened their attention. Jennifer and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their expectations and assumptions. They thought they were about to receive information about my will, possibly updates that would affect their inheritance distributions. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of their financial fantasies. "First, I want you to know that I've been diagnosed with early-stage cancer," I continued, watching their faces carefully. "The prognosis is good with treatment, but it's forced me to make some important decisions about my legacy and how I want my assets distributed." Sarah gasped dramatically, immediately moving toward me with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Mom, why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have been there for you, helped you through this, helped me through this, like they'd helped me through the systematic violation of my privacy, the unauthorized real estate evaluations, and the regular searches of my personal belongings. Like they'd helped me by treating my possessions as inventory items and my home as investment property awaiting liquidation." "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, "but I wanted to make my estate planning decisions with a clear mind, without emotional pressure or family input that might compromise my judgment." Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "What kind of decisions, Mom? Are you talking about updating your will?" "Updating my will?" As if the changes would be minor modifications to an existing plan that still positioned them as primary beneficiaries. As if my cancer diagnosis would simply accelerate their access to assets they'd already been counting on receiving. I'm talking about completely restructuring my estate, I replied, gesturing toward Harold, who began distributing copies of the foundation documents to each family member. Everything I own will now serve a purpose that actually honors the values I've lived by throughout my life. The silence that followed was deafening as they scanned the legal documents, their faces showing confusion, then understanding, then horror as the reality of my decisions became clear. Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice rising with each word. Mom, what is this? The Ruth Marion Whitman Foundation for Military Veterans? You're giving everything to charity? I'm giving everything to people who've earned it through service and sacrifice, I corrected. People who understand that loyalty and respect can't be inherited. They have to be demonstrated through consistent behavior over time.